Welcome to FaithFocus, where we delve into the depths of faith, spirituality, and the lived experiences of Catholics today. I'm your host, Daniela Beasant, and today we're going to unpack the profound concept of religious humility. Religious humility is a cornerstone of our faith, reminding us of our place before God and our need for His grace. But even the most devout can sometimes fall into the trap of believing they've achieved a state of perfection. And this self-deception can lead to pride, a sense of superiority, and a disconnect from the true essence of humility that our faith calls us to embody. Interestingly, in Luciferian dogma, which I don't suggest anybody study in detail, but I have, there's a twisted approach that takes ego flaws and turns them into a kind of dogma, claiming to combat the self-deception that they claim is caused by religiosity. Their solution is to abandon religion entirely and worship the self, which is interesting because it's the self-worship of pride that caused the sins in the first place. It wasn't the religion. And that's how Luciferianism attracts people that are leaving the church, by pointing out the flaws in religious people that don't manage their pride. And they will claim it's the religion that caused it, but it wasn't. It was the religion created the platform for someone's pride to cultivate, but that pride would cultivate anywhere that person was, whether it was work or any other secular endeavor, right? It just happens that it got used in a religious aspect, and that's where they confuse you, because at least, so they'll say, well, come to Luciferianism because we're going to cure you of all those ego flaws, which the whole basis of Luciferianism is to undo those kind of ego flaws. However, if that person instead had stayed in the church, they could have managed that pride under the pastoral care of a parish priest. So instead, you go to the opposite end of the, realm, and you go to Luciferianism, which will work on your ego flaws, sure, but then leaves you devoid of God, where you could still cure your ego issues under the care of a pastoral priest and be closer to God, as opposed to far removed from God. This inversion serves as a stark reminder of how easily we can be led astray by our own pride. And in this episode, we're going to explore how religious people do trick themselves into believing they're beyond reproach, either from subtle attitudes of self-righteousness to overt displays of spiritual arrogance. We're also going to discuss practical ways to cultivate genuine humility, ensuring our hearts remain open to God's transforming love and grace. So please stay with us as we navigate this vital aspect of our spiritual journey, striving to reflect the humility of Christ in all that we do. So what prompted me to record this in the first place was a lecture I attended. It was a presentation by somebody that works for a religious NGO, Catholic, and they are quite powerful in this realm. And they were giving us a lecture on the concept of migration and open borders and having an open heart. And they framed the entire lecture around the Good Samaritan. And there were aspects of the lecture that, of course, had me take pause and reflect. And there was merit in a lot of what was said. However, there was something that was said in passing that really made me, wow, that just came out of your mouth out loud. How dare you? And so I had that moment in the lecture. And to be honest, I found it so off-putting. It made me take everything that person said after that with a grain of salt. So I'll tell you what was said. So she's talking about all this, and she's talking about the parish that she works or she reports to, and the parish priest that's her spiritual director in these endeavors. And I guess he was getting on her for not attending church. And she had the nerve to say, without a moment of hesitation, and she said this to the group with quite a lot of pride, saying, well, I told that priest that, what matters is the love in my heart. So God cares about the love in my heart. He doesn't care how many times in a yearly schedule I attended the mass. And she said it very flippantly, like, this guy's an idiot. She had that tone about her. And I thought, what? You're telling me that you're what? Above the Eucharist? Like, you're so saintly, you don't need the Eucharist? Are you serious? Are you serious? Right? And why? Well, and what makes you so awesome that you're above the Eucharist, or above the need of the Eucharist and attending your Mass? Is it why? Because you do good works? Because clearly, and you know, I was about to say, clearly you haven't read our catechism, but it's funny because another thing she mentioned in her speech is how she likes to teach moving beyond the catechism. And it's like, yeah, I think you need to go back and reread the catechism, because in the Catholic faith, good works alone doesn't cut it to get into heaven. And the reason it doesn't is to protect you from this pride, because a lot of people, it's not so hard to just cash a big check, right? Oh, I've donated millions to charity, so I'm a saint, and therefore I can be a jerk everywhere else in my life, right? So, you know, or even donate a lot of time, and you think, oh, I'm a saint because I volunteer all this energy, and it's like, yeah, but you also get PR flash for that, and accolades from everybody around you, and you love looking like you're such a benevolent person. So how do you know that it's not because you really want to help the other, but because you're being fed, you know, from charity, because charity does feed you. So intrinsically, the Luciferians believe this also, that intrinsically there's a selfishness in charity, in the sense that you benefit from it too. So to pretend that whatever you're doing is purely altruistic, you know, unless you're like Jesus who's being crucified, like the sacrifice is that intense, your good works isn't enough, because that does not erase every other sin that you may be walking with in life. So this person was like, well, there's love in my heart, therefore I don't need to go to church. And it's like, well, so you're telling me that you're nice and therefore you don't need the Eucharist just because you're nice? That's ludicrous to me. So to me, that's symptomatic of that kind of pride. And even the fact that you would dare admonish your priest. Like, seriously? So your ego is so big, and because you work at this big, you know, Vatican NGO or whatever, you think that now you're wiser than your priest, you're smarter than your priest, and you should lecture him on what's important and what isn't. How dare you? How dare you? And to write off the Eucharist, you know, like, because for me, the mass, you know, the singing, the standing, whatever, that's not it. Like, Mass is the Eucharist. And again, from someone who I teach beyond the catechism, it's like, yeah, clearly, clearly, right? So we go to Mass for the Eucharist. Everything else is just the lead up and the, you know, the preamble to the show, but the show is the Eucharist. And that's why we go. So because you work for a charity, you think that makes you exempt from needing the Eucharist. And I could tell from this lady's pride, she needs the Eucharist more than the average sinner out there that doesn't work for a charity. So I found that really gross, actually. It really, really grossed me out. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to take all your advice with a grain of salt, because I can't trust it. And, you know, another one would be, for example, okay, here's another example I heard. So there are exorcists, Catholic exorcists, that are quite popular on social media, and they've been doing some really great educational videos on why you shouldn't take on some practices that have become a fad in the West, like yoga. And exorcists are saying very clearly, we are having so many problems, so many new exorcisms required because of people that are innocently practicing yoga, and they think they're just doing it for the exercise. They didn't mean to get involved in any of the spirituality behind it. You know, they went into it quite ignorantly and yet are still under bondage. And exorcisms that used to take 4 hours are now taking 4 to 6 years. Imagine. Sometimes some people are under demonic oppression for years, and it takes for an exorcist to break it. So now they're trying to warn people. But then you got some younger, you know, priests that, like there was one in Vancouver, for example, that challenged this. So, and this guy had the gall to say, I don't know much about yoga. I don't know anything about this. However, I don't think it's a big deal. I don't see what a big deal it is. So you're a new priest. I could tell from your age that you're a new priest. You haven't been doing exorcisms. You clearly haven't been trained in it. You're clearly not listening to any of them. And the priests that are warning of this have been around a lot longer than you. I don't see if it's a big deal if you're just doing it for exercise. Really, even after the experts of the church that have been dealing with the fallout of this for years and years and years, you're going to claim to know better, even while in the same breath saying that you know nothing about it. So sometimes even priests can lead people astray. And as a matter of fact, when I strayed from the church so many years ago, one can say, because just before that, I had a priest suggest some books that he thought I should read, and he even told me these are banned books. I would be in a lot of trouble if my bishop knew I was telling you to read these books, but I think they're really great, and they were New Age books. Now, we're going to blame me for leaving the church. I'm not going to blame this priest. I'm not going to blame those books. However, let's acknowledge that maybe a seed was planted there when a priest told me, you don't have to listen to your bishop. It doesn't matter what the Vatican says. We can do our own things outside those rules. And that set up a dangerous, dangerous seed in my head that eventually turned into me leaving the church and going full-blown into New Age. So, sometimes that it's bad enough when your ego and your pride keeps you away from God. And especially if you're a man of God and you've taken vows, and now your ego and your pride is going to cause you to lead people astray. Ooh, I imagine that's not a fun thing to reckon with in the afterlife. And to go back to yoga, on the flip side of the yoga conversation is also a sense of pride where the West has appropriated those practices, in the sense that most people that are doing them don't even know what they're practicing. And that's because the arrogance and the pride of Westerners that have learned these traditions and then brought them and only pick and choose. They cherry pick the parts that they like. And then you think that, well, that exempts me from all the other parts of it. First of all, how rude is that? It's rude for you to go to somebody's religion, any religion, and say, hey, I don't respect anything you people do. I believe in nothing. But this one practice that you have, I like the aesthetic of this one piece of jewelry, or I like this one physical practice of yours, or this one philosophy that your religion, embraces. And I'm going to take that for myself, and I'm going to create my own belief system around it, but I'm going to ignore everything else you say. So I like this one part, but the rest is hooey. That's insulting. And for you to think you know better is where the pride is coming from. And so, for example, if you're a new Catholic and you say, well, I really like praying the rosary, or I really like, going to Mass maybe, but I don't like any of the other things. So I think the rest of it's garbage. There's pride there too. Or I don't need that because I resonate with this and not that. I don't need that. That's also pride. That's also arrogance. When you think that you know better than the 2,000-year-old religion that's been guiding people in a very good path for years. And can we be honest? If you really had all the answers, you wouldn't have been going to religion in the first place. So if something called you to Catholicism, if you felt the call of the Holy Spirit to go back to Christianity or to approach Catholicism, to go into it as, well, I'm only going to approach the parts I'm interested in, and I'm not going to give any credence to any of the other stuff, you're walking into it very limited, because not only are you wrong and arrogant to do that, but you're also missing out on all of the fruits that come with all these other practices that you're depriving yourself of in your closed-mindedness and in your arrogance. So one struggle, for example, with the Eucharist, believing that it is truly the blood and body or resurrection. A lot of people struggle with believing in the resurrection or in the Immaculate Conception. All three of those are necessary to call yourself a Catholic. And then you might be thinking, yeah, but I'm really struggling with that. Well, so have a lot of the doctors of the faith, so have a lot of saints. They've had moments of struggling with that. That's why we call it the great mystery, the mystery of faith, because it's hard to grasp, it's hard to understand. It's part of what's beautiful, is the parts you don't understand. But what you do is, instead of saying, well, I don't get it, which means I don't believe it. So if I don't understand it, I'm just not going to believe it, because that's easier. And I'm going to say it's hooey and not even try and ignore that part. I would say my advice would be, well, instead of just writing it off, why not just bring it to God and say, hey, God, you know what? I'm really struggling with this. I don't, they say that I need to believe in the Immaculate Conception or whatever it is, and I'm really having a hard time believing it. If you could please, help me to understand this. You'd be surprised. You will come across the perfect video. Somebody will say something in your next encounter, and that will suddenly come to a peace within yourself, or you'll come to an understanding you can live with. But bring that to God and let God help you understand it. Because there's an arrogance when you say, because I don't understand a thing, it must not be true. And I'm going to claim to want religious life, but then don't ask God to help me with the parts that I'm struggling with, right? And sometimes I think we get so caught up in the act of being religious, we forget that the whole point of it is to build an intimate relation with Jesus, an intimate relationship with God, a God that speaks, a God that speaks to you and works actively in your life, a God that's alive. I think sometimes we forget, because Jesus died on the cross, we're so focused on the death and on the sacrifice and on the cross, I don't think we really pay attention to the resurrection to understand that beyond just that it happened or to believe that it happened. But if he resurrected, that means he still exists. That means he's still alive. That means he can still be active in your life. And we so often forget to include him in the parts of our faith that we struggle with. So that's why we end up picking and choosing things naively, because we're choosing from our very limited understanding and our ego, which is a disaster. I think praying for humility, I've been doing that a lot lately. I've been including humility in my prayers, because especially being somebody in media that has an audience here, it's growing slowly, but in other parts of my life, it isn't, like in the political corporate stuff, right? So I'm please keep my ego in check is something that I pray, because I know how dangerous your ego can be. And it gets people in trouble in all sorts of, aspects of life. And even professionally, it'll hurt you. So if you start to feel that you're above the rules, there's the symptoms of the ego, right? You're above the rules. Anything you don't understand is automatically wrong. So for example, when I heard this lady speak the other day, there were two things that I told you that she said that were kind of off-putting to me. But that doesn't mean that every other part of her speech was wrong. There were some aspects of her speech that was actually quite transformative for me and gave me a few really strong epiphanies. So, if I had let my ego get in the way, I would have been so distracted by what she said wrong, I wouldn't have gained the value that there actually was for me in listening to her. So a big part of challenging your ego is learning how to listen, especially to things you disagree with. Because we've been living in an era of algorithms for so many years, we're used to an algorithm that shows us what we want to hear. So our online lives are sometimes an echo chamber. Like I know my mom, for example, the algorithm, shows her a lot of right-wing conservative stuff. So then she'll call me and say, everybody's mad at this politician, or everybody's thinking this. And it's like, well, Mom, like everybody you're listening to or everyone you're exposed to, perhaps. But there's a whole other half of the kingdom that may not agree with you. You just don't know they exist because you're not being exposed to them, because you're only hearing from your echo chamber. So it's really, really important that you learn how to listen to things you don't agree with without automatically dismissing them, without being prayerful about it first. But I would caution that, we have church leadership for a reason. And yes, I gave an example of a priest that potentially started to lead me astray, or the priest I saw on social media the other day saying that yoga isn't a big deal, even though, a dozen exorcists are like screaming on the mountaintop for people not to do it. So this one priest is undoing a lot of their very good work. And although that's very true, for the most part, there's accountability in the church. That priest that said that he would have been in trouble if his bishop knew he was suggesting these certain books to me, right? At some point, he probably got caught. At some point, there would be some accountability there. But again, just because one or two priests are giving bad advice, it doesn't mean that you don't take your stuff to your priest. So when you're starting to skip the rules, like not going to Mass and not receiving the Eucharist, and your priest calls you out, you don't lecture him. You don't automatically write him off. At least pray on what he said. Like, I'll give you another example that just happened to me. So again, I work in the political realm, and I represent some people professionally that are in military research and development. That scares a lot of people. That is especially as a religious person, right? That sounds scary because you just hear war machine, right? So you're just killing. Oh my God, this is all so bad. Happens that the companies that I represent are into life preservation when it comes to war. So they're working on technologies that will mean less boots on the ground, mean less collateral damage, and also highly targeted so that we can reduce collateral damage not only in our soldiers, but in civilian life as well. So even the parts of war that I work with are related to, to the preservation of life. And even though they are, I know that I have to check myself because I'm working in the war industry. So I bring that to my priest. And I'll go to confession and say, the stuff I'm struggling with or whatever, my work politically, right? And again, my political work has exclusively been with the conservative side of politics. That just is where I landed. And that's where I feel comfortable, and I resonate a lot with the ideology in the conservative realm of things, and therefore it's a fantastic space for me to work in. I feel very integrated, like all the parts of myself are integrated in that space. Having said that, there's two sides to all of the things, so I still have to ensure that I don't become, as my, Father Marsalis tells me, we have to make sure you don't turn into Margaret Thatcher, and it was funny because he said that to me, and I'm like, really, Father? Because that's the one politician I'd put on my wall, like, I actually really admire her. And he said, you see, that's why you need me. So anyway, I bring that stuff to my priest because he knows me. And the longer he's in my parish, the more he gets to know me. He can spot when I'm moving astray. He even said to me yesterday in confession, he said, Neil, I want you to come to confession more. And it's funny because as confessions go, my confessions are pretty boring, right? So there's not a lot to say, thankfully. They're really boring, but he wants me to come more. And the reason he wants me to come more is precisely because of the industry I work, right? So that he can, less about me having things to confess, more about him being able to keep an eye on me because of the tone I take in my confession, right? Where he could say, hey, your ego's out of it, or you're becoming calloused, or you're seeing something, in too strict a way. So my priest is there to keep me. It's not just about giving him the laundry list of ways I could be better. It's that through confession, beyond just giving me the sacrament, that's a moment of really relationship building with him. So that as I go, he knows what to ask of me. To say, yeah, you mentioned all this other stuff, but, you haven't mentioned this in a while. How are you doing in this regard? That's a really good support to have, to help you be the best person you can be. So to automatically say, well, I do so many good works, I don't need the spiritual pastoral care of a priest, is not just naive and rude and arrogant, it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's precisely those kind of ego tricks that, make you dangerous as a religious person. Because soon, like her, right, the same way she doesn't feel like the rules of attending Mass or the importance of attending the Eucharist, that doesn't apply to her. She's also now saying, I teach catechism, but when I teach catechism, I've moved beyond the catechism. To what? To heresy? You know what I mean? Because that's what it sounded like to me. So I think that we need to really, really be mindful. And again, also, that we don't get tricked by somebody else's ego. Because it could be very easy for me to look at her job position and, all the clout she gets, and she's an international speaker. I could have easily listened to her, and because especially I was in a very receptive mental place when I was attending this thing. I went for transformational leadership. That's why I was there, to hear this quasi-heresy being blurted out with so much pride, boastful arrogance. I could have easily said, well, she must be right. So maybe the catechism isn't important. Maybe going to Mass isn't important. She doesn't go to Mass, so much so that her priest lectures her about it. And then she tells the priest where to go in not so many terms. So she, I want to be more like her. And it's like, yeah, guess what? No, actually, thank you. Thank you for the speech, because you're reminding me of what not to let myself become and not to get confused by my good works. To say I do all this volunteering and community building and whatever, and I'm so loving and I don't judge anybody, and therefore I'm a saint. As a matter of fact, some of the political stuff she was proposing, although sounds virtuous, was spectacularly naive. Spectacularly naive. So it's like, wow, no, you are not the mirror of which I would like to emulate. You are the opposite of that. But I'm so grateful to see that, because it reminded me. And it was funny because as she's talking about dismissing her priest, I'm, having flashbacks of Father Marsalis telling me, we can't turn you into Margaret Thatcher, right? So it's like, okay, I'm going to listen to Father Marsalis. I'm going to stay humble, and I'm going to pray for humility. All this time I've been focusing on praying for wisdom and praying for discernment. Those are my two main asks in prayer, but I'm going to include humility in that Trinity. I'm going to, that's my triune prayer to my triune God. I'm praying for wisdom, discernment, and humility. I wasn't before. I was only praying for wisdom and discernment. But I don't want to inadvertently lead somebody to sin. I also don't want to convince myself that I'm better than I am, because I would rather be humble and then let God give me accolades than work on public recognition or self-recognition and then suffer when I get to the afterlife and Jesus say, it doesn't matter that you worked in all these charities. It doesn't matter that you did all these nice things. Inherently, you were just doing it to worship your own sense of accomplishment or your own pride. Don't pretend you were doing it for me. Right? So it's really, really important. So anyway, for me personally, humility has become a big part of something I ask for in prayer, and something that I'm contemplating a lot on. And I do a lot of observation, not only of myself, most especially of myself, but also others. So that when I spot it in someone, it's not so that I can condemn or judge them or even rebuke them for that matter. It wasn't my place the other day in that group meeting. You know what I mean? It wasn't for me to speak. She was giving a presentation. But it was important for me to take note of it, so that not to condemn her, although I'm doing that now, but not to condemn her, but to convict myself should I see that start to grow in me. So that if I ever catch myself saying, I've done so much good this week, I've helped so many people, I don't need to go to church. Like, Jesus won't mind if I sleep in this morning. You know what I mean? That I have to watch myself, because as soon as I catch myself playing that game, hopefully with my guardian angel's assistance, I'll remember that lady. And I'll remember how appalled I was when I heard her first say that. And then so I can recognize that potentially in myself and not fall into her same pit. So sometimes when you're watching and are able to acknowledge for yourself, hey, I know I'm supposed to listen to everything this person says, but wow, that's heresy, you know what I mean? Or that's beyond, the norm. That's good for you to be able to do that. Just make sure that you're not doing it in I'm a better Catholic than her because I go to church every Sunday and the Eucharist is the center of my life and it's not hers. That's not what this is about. It's more about, look at how she was deceived. And she's someone you would think would be protected from that deception because of the circles that she operates in. But it's actually those circles that kind of make it easy because you feel like I don't need to be vigilant. All my friends are priests. I'm doing, I work for a Catholic charity. I do all this stuff. So therefore, I'm in the clear. And it's like, no, you're never in the clear. As a matter of fact, it's in those moments that you have to be more vigilant because it's so easy to become spiritually complacent. And that's what the big caution is. So when you're starting to recognize this behavior in other people, like I said, it's not to make you better than them. It's like a cautionary tale so that you can spot it in others, hopefully to spot it in yourself so that you could pray that away, or root it out as much as possible before it actually takes root in your consciousness and potentially erodes the intimacy you have with Christ. This lady, because she works with migrants and she does so much important, very, very important work with migrants, it's easy for her to say, well, I help all these migrants and therefore I'm automatically holy. Instead of, I do all this important work and, it might make me spiritually arrogant into thinking that I'm some special saint and really I'm not. And wow, I just caught myself admonishing a priest that's actually here to lead me. And I just dismissed the Eucharist as, something I can do occasionally, like attending a restaurant I like once in a while because I feel like it, you know what I mean? But, for me, the Eucharist is like, not taking the vitamin that makes you feel better, right? Like I have a thyroid problem. If I miss a few days of thyroid medication, I feel that right away, so I take it every day so that it keeps me on the level. The Eucharist is the same thing. You take that every week, hopefully at least once a week, and that keeps you on the level. And in order to receive the Eucharist every week, kind of keeps in mind how much sin you're going to allow yourself to do because you have to be in a state of grace to receive the Eucharist. So I find myself extra vigilant at avoiding sinning so that I can receive the Eucharist on Sunday, because receiving the Eucharist for me is as important as breathing. There is no, occasional or optional or not a big deal. It is the deal. Like that's the whole point. That is what differentiates Catholics from all the other 60,000 denominations of Protestantism. So if you're looking at the Eucharist as an option, then you're practically a Protestant. So if you want Catholicism, because that is the religion Jesus gave, every other denomination that came after, like Luther didn't come around till 1,500 years after Jesus died. So you telling me that Jesus got it wrong for 1,500 years and then he sent Luther to fix it? Like, give me a break. You know what I mean? So every denomination that came after the original Catholicism was started by an ego trip. I dare you to prove me wrong. I dare you. You find one denomination outside of Catholicism that did not start with someone's ego saying, the way I describe the Bible, the way I view Christianity is better than the 2,000 years of experts that came before me. So I'm just going to start my own, version of Christianity. And now, we've had 70,000 of those ego trips, because that's roughly how many denominations are out there. So that, and now what's happened from that with those ego, right? All of those denominations, unlike the Catholic Church that's universal and has that universal leading body, and that keeps us very cohesive. So, I heard somebody in my class yesterday say, because they travel the world for work, and they say, it doesn't matter where I am at work in the world, I can go to any Catholic church and the Mass is the same, even if I don't understand the words. The structure of the Mass is the same anywhere I go in the world, and that gives me a lot of comfort and a feeling of stability no matter where I am in the world. Well, these 70,000 denominations that came after it don't have any of that, because they all make things up as their ego sees fit, and there's no unity there. So the Methodists are opposed to the Baptists, which are opposed to the Lutherans, which are opposed to the Latter-day Saints. So they're all sitting there in opposition to one another, even though they have the majority of things in common. The most important one, it started on an ego trip, right? But because all those denominations started on an ego trip, those egos won't allow all these denominations to have a unifying cohesiveness, right? They're all very splintered and individual. I know of Ontario, a Lutheran church that just closed, and all the congregants had to find other religions to go to because there's no other Lutheran church anywhere near there. And there's no leadership, unifying body. So, for example, we had a priest at my parish recently, that had to be reassigned. And, in 2 days, we had a new priest, right? And we had with the church closed in Halifax, but a neighboring church was able to absorb all of those people. So they lost a physical building, but they never lost their church. Where in Christian denominations, that are all singular because they're all based on one person's big ego trip, when something happens to that person or to the leadership of that building, the entire congregation is lost and dead forever. Where with Catholics, at the worst, you just got to move around a little bit. So this is where those ego trips have a detrimental impact. And all of those people, some went to other Christian churches, some just stopped going to church. They were all a separation from God. They were all a separation from universality. And what does universality do? Potentially cure racism. According to Catholic dogma, as long as you are a baptized Catholic, you are equal to every other baptized Catholic. So the qualifying question isn't what culture you are, what gender you are, what anything you are. The only question we ask is, are you baptized? And if you're not, don't worry, it can be arranged. You know what I mean? So, that's the only thing, which means in a Catholic church, there is no bias. There is no, racism among Catholics, because a true Catholic only cares about whether or not you're baptized. They don't care whether you're black, blue, or green, right? They only care about whether or not you're saved. So, there's a beauty to that global universality. Of course the devil doesn't want that, right? Of course not. So instead, let's create 60,000 splintered denominations, all based on individual ego trips, and then have them all fighting against each other. And in that, God gets lost. Universality, the concept of universality gets lost. So that had a detrimental impact on society. And that was all the cause of pride. So anyway, all I'm saying today is, when you're saying your prayers, include humility. And if you are doing all the things right as a religious person, that doesn't exempt you from the religion. That doesn't exempt you from, being imperfect or being a sinner. As a matter of fact, it could make you easy to deceive, because you will confuse your good works for a pure soul. And, let Jesus determine how holy you are. Let Jesus determine whether or not you're exempt from certain practices. But if Jesus believed that some people didn't need the Eucharist, that would have been clarified at first. But he didn't. As a matter of fact, he said that you must receive the Eucharist. If you want more on that, look at John 6:53-56. Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them." And then it goes on to say the necessity of that, and there's a blowback. His followers at the time freak out and say, "Gross, that's cannibalism." No, that's weird. And he freaked out a lot of people with that. And in that moment, he could have stepped it back. He could have stepped it back and said, "Well, what I meant to say was," and he didn't. he doubled down on it, and a lot of followers left. Some followers freaked out when they heard that, and when he doubled down, they actually walked away, and he let them. And he let them. So don't forget that. Be blessed, everyone.